This presentation will look at some inscriptional evidence that records diplomatic events and interactions in the Hellenistic period. Firstly, looking at a letter from a Hellenistic king who accepts a gift from a city, and then looking at an inscription that talks about honouring an ambassador that conducted a successful embassy to Rome. These will be examined in light of what they can reveal about ancient habits of visualizing peace in the Hellenistic period, and how language in particular is employed as a means to camouflage certain complexities, realities, and how it also obscures voices and perspectives, both during antiquity and potentially for the modern reader too, and how we might be able to change this. So to begin, I'd like to lay out some trends in scholarship and how they've examined this material before looking at the primary sources. Firstly, scholars seem to agree that the inscriptional evidence, whether recording a royal degree from a letter or another diplomatic interaction, draws on a set formulaic language. Scholars also attribute this as being reflective of a new political reality that came about in the Hellenistic period. That is, the governing area of the Greek world had expanded massively. Each Hellenistic kingdom had to communicate decision-making over large distances with as little disruption to the centralized power as possible. This reality also applied to the Romans, since their governing center was even further away in Italy. Thus, discursive language is used because it facilitated these decisions being made, giving the illusion of discussion without causing supposed upset, revolt, etc. Whether this is actually true will be analysed. And scholars also agree that this language took on set formulas, conventions, decisions, political events in these inscriptions were communicated as if a discussion had taken place, often talking about a backstory, a past precedent, past behaviour, past relationship between the recipient and the sender involved, following with the considerations that were being taken into account, building up to the actual decision which the inscription entailed, concerns, and then looking into the future for this projected relationship outcome to continue. And scholars draw or point out that there's similarity between the language employed by a king when describing a decree and also how a city adopts this same language, or often of friendliness, etc., to talk about political interaction. It's in fact very similar. And John Marr has coined this as the language of euergetism and or reciprocity, that to some degree these diplomatic records reflect that some sort of exchange had taken place that occurred between the city and the governing body. He acknowledges that it was between unequal powers, but emphasises the fact that mutual benefit was derived. The ruler maintained peace, and when they were not often physically present in the region, and the city was funded and protected. This will be unpacked later. And scholars also focus on the fact that the Romans capitalised on this set language and the conventions of political interaction between a Hellenistic king and a city, and use this to embed their power in the Greek world, establishing expectations that they would rule in the same way. This will also be unpacked. So yes, to look at some primary material, I've left the inscriptions at the end, but I've pulled out some pertinent sections that I think will elucidate our understanding. So the first one is a letter from King Antiochus, either 1 or 2, it's uncertain, the first or the second. And it communicates him accepting the gift of the Erythrae people of gold, and in turn grants them continued autonomy, in inverted commas, exemption from taxes and exemption from another fund. And it's notable that, first of all, he frames it within this past precedent, a past relationship, not just with him as a king that this city has, but with previous kings. That's really interesting. Then this idea that there is an exchange, there is a dynamic of exchange, giving and receiving is occurring, is built and established, that the city will gain tangible benefit, and he also as a king is gaining tangible benefit. And this is all couched in the language of friendliness, in the discourse of friendliness, a bit like the language of reciprocity that John Marr talks about. And this then links into looking to the future again. That's that convention of hoping that this relationship, or implying this relationship, will continue between king and city. The second one is a record of a Greek and Roman interaction. This inscription seems to be written from the perspective of the city Lampascus in Ionia, written for the purpose of honouring a particular ambassador, Hegesias, who went and completed a successful embassy in Rome. It is first emphasised that there was clear benefit for both him in being honoured and also for the city. Even if the journey was arduous, costly, dangerous, he will be given public recognition, and by doing that will confer benefit on the city. And it's posed as if he's doing this as a public service, a level of self-sacrifice, an interesting narrative to tell about peace building. And again, we see this language of friendship in a different manifestation, language of allyship, kinsman, brotherhood, etc., playing into the conventions we saw in the previous source, a set language that sort of is used to talk about political interaction and negotiation. But does this actually line up with reality, or is this just a projected discourse that is used repeatedly? And this discourse of friendliness and friendship translates very quickly into the language of peace, which is an interesting thing to think about. So yes, how can we think about these texts differently and look at them a bit more critically? Well, I think first of all, it's important to note that scholarship talks about a binary between a king and community that can, at some points, that can be an unhelpful way to conceptualize what's going on here, because it can solidify a certain focus on the material. And this needs reframing to acknowledge that this isn't exclusively an elite discourse that is going on. It's between a body of political officials on both sides, in the top stratas of society, and it's exclusively a top-down record of a diplomatic agreement being reached. You know, the voice is not by no means representative of the whole community. Talking about the binary of the rule and ruled is helpful to a point, because that's how it's conceptualized in the inscription. But it's important to recognize who's dictating this conversation, that it's an elite agenda that's writing this and leading the way. In the same way, scholars have done good analysis on this language of reciprocity, mutual benefit, but it's important to unpack the formulaic nature of this and how much this actually did line up with reality, and also to recognize the limitations of recognizing patterns of this set language. It is important to show that, to some degree, couching a political interaction in terms of there being tangible mutual benefit for both parties probably did actually in some way facilitate the Hellenistic kings and the Romans governing and peace building in a top-down manner. It also projects the idea that these cities as cohesive communities had collective consent. Using the word discursive implies that you're dealing with two equal parties. We're not. It doesn't allow space for the fact that perhaps these cities were facing other external threats, internal threats. Did they actually derive the benefits that were talked about? Was it just a discourse that had to be played into? I think there needs more space for these recognitions, and it's not representative of all voices. You know, voices, reactions, contributions, perspectives of civilians are excluded from these. And yes, and thirdly, it needs to be more widely recognised that a particular set of evidence comes to us. These inscriptions were written down for political purposes. They were inscribed in stone, probably because a political agreement that had been reached that didn't want to be changed or fallen back on, and writing in stone prevented this from happening. And it was also used to honour and elevate certain elite individuals and tell a certain narrative. And this, you know, we assume plays back into reality, but actually, is it reflective of reality? Probably not. Even if the inscription was put in a prominent place in the Hellenistic city, the majority of citizens couldn't read. So again, we need to recognise that this serves an elite agenda. And yeah, scholars often also don't acknowledge that political events are framed in a positive light. This must also surely corroborate that these inscriptions are serving a political agenda, bolstering the city's status rather than being reflective of the peace building that was going on. They were perhaps being used as opportunities to rewrite historical events and to serve the political agenda of people in positions of power. And lastly, there's been a temptation in scholarship to recognise the similarities between the interactions between Hellenistic kings and their cities and translate this directly on to the language used between the Romans and the Hellenistic cities because of the similarity in language. By all means, the Romans probably did capitalise on this language, and this furthered their agenda of the Pax Romana and achieving pacification in Greece. It probably brushes over the fact a little bit, the problematic nature of the language in the first place, that this language is camouflaging real political dynamics, and that the Hellenistic kings might have also used it to pacify regions and impose a perpetrator's peace and record events in a certain manner. The fact that they were using this ideologically charged language even created it, or couched agreements in this way, suggests that they were operating in this way. How friendly was this interaction? Probably not, as it's being described. This friendly language is a means of talking about a political interaction and not actually reflective of it. And I think this draws us onto more thinking about how can we be more aware about not characterizing the Romans as the more brutal counterparts to the Greeks, as often has been done in antiquity. How can we look at this more critically? They might actually be more similar. And so lastly, I think it'd be interesting to think about how what is seen in these inscriptions can be helpful when conducting modern peace studies. And I think the biggest takeaway would be the importance of language, that language is a political technique that colours and frames interactions and events in a certain way and narrates them in a certain way. And we should be aware of how embedded and established a political language becomes, and it becomes the default and makes us immune to really understanding the consequences of top-down peace building, makes top-down peace building the norm, because it's just so recognizable and has gained such traction. And we should really focus on how we continuously coin new language that interrupts certain narratives being formed. So, yeah, thank you for listening.